We're planning some audio workshops with the public, and we're having a chat about how the most important thing is to make sure they press record. Because the number of times where we've been out with field recorders or whatever, and then you don't press the button. The most perfect clip, and I lost it.
Hello and welcome to The Rest is Just Noise, a monthly podcast all about the science, beauty, and noise of our cities. I'm Andrew. I'm an acoustician and a soundscape researcher, joined by my co-hosts.
I'm Francisco. I'm an architect and a soundscape researcher.
I'm Tin. I'm an architect and an urban planner and a soundscape researcher.
Today we are talking with Professor Gascia Ouzounian and Dr. Ruth Bernatek from the University of Oxford about their ongoing project, Sound Cities, a project which brings together sound theorists, urban sociologists, architects, urban designers, and sound artists to develop critical approaches to sonic urbanism. Their goal is to foster socially conscious approaches to sonic urban practice in terms of research, analysis, and design.
Shall we continue?
Press record.
Maybe I pressed it, maybe I didn't.
Yeah, but you've got the red button now. It's perfect. Clear.
The rest is just noise. Welcome again, Gascia.
Hi.
Thanks very much for joining us. And we're also now joined by your colleague, Dr. Ruth Bernatek,
Hi.
who is an architectural and urban historian and theorist at Oxford as well. Ruth, would you like to say sort of what your background is and how you came into this sort of work? Because it really does feel like your project in Sound Cities is sort of marrying these two sorts of things of architecture and music in a really interesting way.
Yeah, so we were joking earlier that that my background feels quite familiar within this field, which is, one where you have some musical training and actually sort of, even at sort of a high amateur level, where you're sort of playing and performing. And I play and perform as a flautist, as a vocalist, but didn't pursue it professionally. My academic background is in art history, actually. My undergraduate is in art history. My master's is in visual and screen media, and my PhD is in architectural history and theory. So, so I think I've got, 3 degrees all in a different subject area, plus this kind of musical background. And I think that lots of people who find themselves sort of where we are do have this quite composite sort of background. I mean, everybody does to some extent, but I think for me, the reason that I started to travel down this route was actually at the end of my undergraduate. We had a seminar on the Phillips Pavilion, and it did just make me think that, okay, there's a relationship here that isn't just acoustics, actually. There's a relationship here between music and space, which I understand because I have a certain fluency in sort of formal musical notation. On the one level, that building was actually created from a score, from the score of Metastasis, which was a piece that Xenakis composed. So you start to sort of bring in all of these threads from your own background, and they marry together and sort of move forward into applying them at a urban scale, or in a city scenario, which isn't something which I anticipated, if I'm very honest. It's something that, happens as you keep going. Doing sound making space at the Bartlett was incredibly important to me as a network that was running from about 2017. And initially it was a response to not having a music department at UCL and doing a PhD in music and architecture. I was like, how can we get people in the room? I know, let's start a network. Okay, and then we can invite these people into our space, and that's how
very interdisciplinary, your series. Yeah.
And like you and your podcast, we had people coming from all these different disciplines, and then you realize that you're not, like you say, in a vacuum, that you're actually working with all these people constantly. So, I think in some ways, I would consider myself an interdisciplinarian in its sort of core sense.
So eventually we're going to get into what you guys are working on now, but I want to start sort of where we left off the last episode, with some of this spatial music that you were talking about.
Yeah. So we were talking about my book, Stereophonica, which is kind of tracing histories of conceptualizations of sound in relation to space, whether in scientific studies, in music, and I end up in an area that I think we'll get into later in the podcast, which is sonic urbanism, so sound in relation to cities. And we were previously talking about early studies in auditory space perception, as well as early binaural and stereo technologies. And then to kind of move from that kind of scientific realm and also studies in industry, for example, at Bell Telephone Laboratories, into what was happening in the world of music. That was something that I thought was really important, actually, to illustrate in the book, that these ideas were not happening in a vacuum, that there was a lot of actually overlap and dialogue between musical practitioners and musical communities, as well as scientific communities. So, for example, we had been speaking about scientists at Bell Telephone Laboratories who were doing experiments in stereo recording, reproduction, as well as transmission and binaural recording and transmission. Well, an artist who was very interested in collaborating with them was Edgar Varese, who actually applied for a Guggenheim grant. Sadly, he wasn't awarded it, which is, in retrospect, you think, what were they thinking? But, he, a very influential French composer who at the time was a expat living in the United States. And anyhow, he was very interested in creating what he called a spatial music and, developing also a language as well as tools and methods around that before they were able to do this kind of multi-channel recording and reproduction. He said he had this dream of a spatial music when he was even a child because he felt claustrophobic as a child and he wanted to make music of sounds set free. And then he applied that kind of in this, let's say, spatial audio realm, the first time on a really large scale in the 1950s when he was invited by Le Corbusier, a very well-known architect, maybe one of the most influential architects of the 20th century, to create the musical component of this multimedia, let's say, building and installation at the 1958 Brussels World's Fair from the company Philips, the electronics company. It was the Philips Pavilion. And Ruth Bernatek, who's here, is one of the world's leading experts on Xenakis, who was actually an architect in Le Corbusier's studio at the time. And he did these hyperbole.
Yeah, that's right. So he was also involved in the collaboration with Corbusier and Varese. And he was actually the project architect. So even though it's sort of accredited to Le Corbusier, and we know it is this sort of minor work of Le Corbusier, it was really quite a significant work in sort of Xenakis' development of spatial sound, but also how we might design spaces in a sort of more imaginative way, I suppose, to respond to the different kinds of sound and the different kinds of technologies that were now available in the 1950s and, sort of going on to the 1960s. It was sort of like a prototype of a totally different listening scenario, I suppose. It was really fascinating.
Yeah, that's it. And sorry. Yeah.
No, but I'm just. I mean, Pavilion is no more, sadly.
Alas, no.
Alas, no more. But
actually, that's kind of an interesting point that you raised, because a lot of these, really quite interesting experiments or sort of test site sort of spaces, buildings, they aren't designed to be permanent. In fact, almost exclusively they're designed to be temporary, and that's one of the reasons why you can sort of push the boundaries of normal building practices, especially at World's Fairs. So it's sad for us that they don't exist anymore. Although I think there are a few research teams that have done some quite sophisticated modelling of that particular pavilion. But actually that's one of the issues, I think, when we look at sort of how sound spaces have developed into the 21st century, is that many of the in-between steps no longer exist
Exactly.
as
So what-
physical objects.
What sort of things were they incorporating into it? Like, what of those technologies at the time were they doing? What were they trying to do with it?
Yeah, so this was, maybe I could just say two words about the pavilion. It was a quite multimedia, let's say Gesamtkunstwerk, is how they were imagining it, kind of this total artwork, which had this very interesting architectural design by Xenakis with these hyperparabolas, paraboloid kind of forms. And I think the first time that was actually implemented in architecture.
Also like a construction landmark, not only in terms of...
Yeah, although, I mean, hyperbolic paraboloid sort of concrete shells were being used, but only in roof structures. So this is the first time that it's being used, you know,
In,
for
like,
the
an
full
internal-
building. Well, it doesn't have any verticals or horizontal supports at all. It's completely curved, so you can imagine it's sort of free. Yeah,
Although
inverted
in
commas, free. Even though it is effectively, you know, made from straight lines.
True.
And so there's this like incredible kind of fantastical almost architectural structure. And that's, you know, originally they just wanted Le Corbusier to do a kind of a shell. And he said, no, I want to do this whole work. And inside they projected film, which was based on a story that Le Corbusier wanted to tell of a history of all humankind. But the filmmakers essentially took kind of slides and photographs from kind of historical, archival art history and ethnographic kind of images. And that was projected onto two, let's say, walls inside, as well as there were 425 or so loudspeakers over which Varèse's music was projected through 11 channels and these different sound routes and sonic trajectories. It took them something like 9 months to just create this 8-minute spatial audio piece, composition by Varèse. And then there was also hanging sculptures as well as colored lights. So it was this whole kind of, you know, experience. Of course, for us, maybe we're more used to having things like that. But for that audience in 1958...
Yeah, it was very innovative of Philips as well, because it was actually Philips who stipulated, you know, we want this pavilion that showcases all of our technology, but sort of not just by, you know, sort of a average display. We don't want someone to go into our pavilion and just see our products lined up, or, you know, we want it to be sort of this experience. So it was quite radical of them as well.
Yeah, they kind of, I guess, came on board, and Le Corbusier insisted that the composer would be Varèse, because the company wanted someone much more conventional, like Benjamin Britten was the one they had in mind, and they
I can't even conceive of how that would work.
I know, and they even had a shadow composer do a shadow piece that they might have switched out Varèse's weird poème électronique.
Noise.
Noise.
Noise is
Just noise.
Just noise. So I think through this sort of connection and collaboration between music and architecture, I think that's sort of brought us into our next topic, which is I'm master of segues right here. Which
Very
is
good.
then
So fluid.
taking this spatial understanding of sound and applying it to cities, how we experience and how we understand cities, which leads to the development of this concept of sonic urbanism. Do you sort of want to give us an introduction of
Sure.
what that actual concept is, and then what you say about it in your book?
So exactly, I think, you know, moving from that realm of sonic architectures, and I think that's something that Ruth would be, you know, particularly well placed to speak on, urban sonic architectures. She's currently writing a chapter on this for a book that we're authoring together, which is going to be kind of like critical studies in sonic urbanism. Sonic urbanism, I suppose, could encompass many things, but many urban studies historically, especially in the 20th century, have been very visually focused, and the methods of urban planners, designers, and many practitioners are quite heavily visual. And so sonic urbanism, I suppose in the most basic sense, could simply be, thinking about the urban sphere and the urban realm through that lens of, and there I've just used a visual metaphor, but through the kind of oral realm. So,
or foregrounding it,
foregrounding
that kind of oral
acoustic
realm.
lenses.
Yeah, acoustic lenses,
Yeah,
perspectives. That's another. So, in the book, I was looking at a kind of specific case study almost of practitioners who are doing very interesting things in the urban sphere around sound and listening, sometimes urban soundscapes, and specifically a group of artists in Beirut. And I did that because I wanted to look at, a city in a more kind of up close way in relation to this idea of thinking about it through that oral lens. And I was quite inspired actually by the range of works that they were doing. That for me, when you're talking about a city like Beirut, which is a very it's a city which it's where I was born, but it was also, we left because of the war. It's a city that people have described as having experienced urbicide because of this very long war, and then a series of many different problems that have come to bear on the, let's say, management and development of that city in the post-war realm. People still think of it as actually a conflict city. It's not even really post-conflict. And I thought these artists were doing things that almost served as evidence of things that are happening in the urban realm that would be difficult to understand or too obscure, especially in a city where you have so many national, international forces kind of coming to bear on what is happening there. And their works, I felt, almost served as evidence and as kind of testimony to people's experiences and the, what is happening in the city. So there were quite a few works that I reference in the chapter, but maybe one that I think both Ruth and I have a, particular interest in. And Ruth invited this artist to speak at the Bartlett School of Architecture when she was running a really, I thought, a very innovative series called Sound Making Space. The artist is called Natalie Harb, and she built this temporary architecture called the Silent Room. Maybe, Ruth, you could tell us about Silent Room.
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk a bit about the Silent Room. I mean, so Natalie, so just to give sort of an idea of what it looks like and how you might encounter it, sort of it's a temporary sort of wooden structure that's situated on the side of an incredibly busy highway in Beirut. Beirut is a noisy city, using noisy in the sort of the fullest sense of the word, and it's also bright pink. So it has quite sort of a presence in this environment as well. And what's that, sorry?
We have to go there.
Yeah.
Now when I hear it like that, it's
but it was it was really sort of a statement on sort of the privilege of silence in many ways. In a city like Beirut, it's available to certain people in certain spaces, and this was effectively making or not a silence. In fact, it was probably better described as sort of a quiet room, really. You could still hear certain sounds. It wasn't like being in an anechoic chamber. But giving that access to anybody in the city to go and experience sort of like a quietness that's not always there, but it's sort of just highlighting sort of those social, political, cultural issues in cities, in this case Beirut, but in many cities.
It's a space where, as Ruth said, it's in this kind of parking lot near this highway and low-income neighborhoods in Beirut. And Beirut is very loud, as Ruth said. Maybe kind of 75, 80 decibels is kind of average. So that is a level at which you do experience some hearing damage, and it's a city where noise management has been very poor, but also almost all other kinds of urban infrastructural management and urban infrastructure has been poor too. But they treated this, she worked with a group of acousticians to treat the space so that it was, reducing the noise levels to something like 30 decibels. But so it's quiet, but you can also still hear the city. And it was then kind of maybe even And they had a soundtrack that was playing there that they had recorded these sounds in the middle of the night at Beirut at the quietest hours. So things like the electrical hums of the generators and maybe things that could bother people normally, but they were then being able to kind of appreciate the sounds of their city and hear things at a kind of comfortable level. And you know, it's almost giving people a sense of an imagined possibility of their city. And as Ruth said, it was freely accessible to anyone. And it was this like social kind of statement then on noise and who is subject to noise and who can escape noise. And
It does make a point about silence as a commodity and also questions about environmental justice and acoustics.
It sort of goes to something that I read recently talking about how there's this idea that people who live in cities get used to the sound, they get used to the noise. And even people who live in cities think that. Like, we'll often be like, oh no, I like the noise of the city, that sort of thing. And I think this sort of helps take you away from that and demonstrate to people that, no, like, you like sounds of cities maybe, but that's different than you like the noise of a city. We can still give you the sounds of the city in the context and
You want to say the vibrancy then?
I mean, noise after all is kind of unwanted. So but it's also a great example of that. When you speak sound design, you always first things comes to mind. So okay, it's not about noise mitigation. It's about adding sound sources. So it's just like making things louder.
See, and I come from noise, and I go the other way of oh no, you just want to get rid of all sounds.
So I suppose in urban planning and soundscape management, there has been a trope, let's say, over the course of the 20th century of this really being driven through this mitigation framework, noise mitigation, acoustical control as well. And that's also, in architectural
and
acoustics.
Sort of how you correct something, for example.
Yeah. And so part of the project that Ruth and I are working on together now, which is based at Oxford for the next 5 years, it's called Sonorous Cities Towards a Sonic Urbanism. And the website is soncities.org. Sorry to plug that, but it's such a long name that
we'll put it down in the description for everyone as well.
It's such a long name that it's kind of easier to just say Soncities. Is to kind of, and we're certainly not the first people to do this, but to kind of think about then in this more creative capacity, how would you approach you could call it urban sound design. You could call it maybe urban sonic practice. And maybe that encompasses sometimes design. Maybe sometimes it's something else, like this thing that Natalie has done, or another group of
another artist that we feel quite inspired by on the project is Jackie Waldock. And her project Welsh Streets, where she does sort of question some of the sort of normal ways that we analyse our sort of urban environment in terms of noise, for example, and, sort of just taking the temperature for different people and how they experience the sound of their urban environment. And, maybe they do want to hear their neighbours, maybe they don't want silence, maybe actually, there are many different aspects of the sonic environment that unless we really understand it from the user's perspective, we don't have access to, even if we might have access to certain quantification techniques or, So I think, certainly how sort of a creative practice or creative methodology might allow us to be more critical about some of the systems that are in place currently, either in sort of a built environment context, or in an academic one, or I think that's something we are quite interested in exploring.
So thinking about reading your website about the project about Sun Cities, you sort of put a bit of a focus on this sort of inclusive and active sort of engagement with, as you said, the people who actually use the space, designers and architects, that sort of thing. How did some of the practicalities of that? How do you see some of the practicalities of that coming through? How does that feed into the design itself and the use itself?
I mean, I could give maybe one example through series of workshops that we ran recently, which is now feeding into Sound Cities. It was almost like a proto kind of testing some of these ideas. And this was called Scoring the City.
Mm-hmm.
And I apologize for having so many similar names to my projects. There's also one called Recomposing the City. Anyhow, but in Scoring the City, we were looking at notation methods that developed within, let's say, experimental practices in music. So things like graphic scores. Think of the, beautiful scores of Cornelius Cardew in the 1960s, or even Morton Feldman, who was doing kind of graphic scoring in the 1950s and 1960s. All the way to now you have, I have a wonderful recent student who's just finished their DPhil called Jonathan Packham, who has done 3-dimensional graphic scores that a performer wears and navigates in 3-dimensional space. And so those kinds of experimental notations, also verbal notation. So you have these like text scores that people associated with Fluxus, especially were doing in the 1960s and 70s. In any case, we were looking at these kind of scoring methods in music and how they produce a very wide range then of interpretations of this musical score. It's no longer this one-to-one, very specified, the kind of modernist, scoring sensibility where you're almost specifying every single action and dynamic and articulation that the musician is doing, but it's much more open. And we introduced that through a series of workshops in different cities to different architects and urban designers and said, look, if you think about kind of scoring, whereas in architecture and urban design, you're really looking at these architectural blueprints as well as urban plans, and there is often a one-to-one, which is almost like that modernist score. How could you maybe incorporate things like improvisation, play, interpretation, a kind of have a more open, urban score?
Is that meant as a design thing of you sort of compose this score ahead of time, or is it, because I could see that also working really well as an analysis tool of we went out and experienced this semi-random thing, which is sound in cities, and we've now been able to notate it in a way which captures the patterns that were happening, but allows for the randomness to be there.
That's exactly right. I mean, I would say exactly. It could be used as a tool for analysis, a tool for use, even after the kind of space is built, let's say, and kind of maybe more informal, unplanned, uses of sometimes spaces which feel quite constricting, or can feel quite constricting. And, we visited different sites, and of course, every site brings up its own questions. Yeah. For example, we went to Sailortown in Belfast, where I'll say it quickly, but it was, a very vibrant urban village, but it was razed in the 1960s to put in a highway, and that community was displaced. But now there's a group called Sailortown Regeneration Group who are looking at, people, that rich actually culture that is gone. And so it's a site really which is concerned with kind of memory and Belfast industrial heritage, and what has remained of Sailortown. Anyway, we invited then architects and designers to create urban scores for Sailortown. What would you do if you were going to score for this space? And one of the architects, he's called Richard Doherty, and he created this really beautiful, vivid, very layered kind of score that has, incorporating a lot of these kind of strategies then of movement, improvisation, almost like performance, but within it, something that looks like an urban plan. And he says that now when he goes to kind of do new designs, he's thinking about scoring versus just creating the one-to-one design. So for me, it's almost a new kind of methodology. Any architect, could use it and maybe it applied in a very different way. But maybe it's a different way of then approaching, what they're doing and how they're thinking about, how this translates within their work.
And I think that word like translate or translation is really key as well, because it's about developing sort of a different vocabulary for discussing this, this subject that allows other people to sort of be part of the discussion without needing, or without feeling sort of worried by a lack of specialist training, for example, or, so if you go into a space and say, I'm an acoustician, and they go, ooh, decibels, what are they? You know, and this is about having a tool which can be used by different user groups with different skill sets, different experiences, and they interpret it in their own way. So I think that's actually a big challenge for this field of research is how we develop a more inclusive language or a different vocabulary for bringing together the sonic and the spatial, you know, productively, as opposed to just closing it off.
That's it. And I would say also exactly just as Ruth said, and for maybe a third kind of prong to that is the social. So the sonic, spatial, and social. And that's something that I think our project is developing at that intersection. With Richard, let's say his score is really about also the social history of that site. So, you know, that's for me when it becomes a kind of more critical appreciation of what's happening in a place or what has happened there. How are people experiencing a site, which is something that I know you guys are very interested in. And that's a social question as well.
I think this whole sort of conversation really highlights a thing about this field, which is not just soundscape, our specific thing, but it is anything to do with sound in cities, that sort of thing. You know, on our podcast, we've had psychologists and sociologists, and then now we've got this. And acousticians, I should say, and architects.
Nothing against acoustics. I mean, exactly. This is the richness. Is I think of a topic like this is exactly it goes across all of these what could be quite rigid disciplinary boundaries sometimes, but they are actually quite porous or can be if you bring those groups together.
And I think this particular one about the looking at those sort of graphical scores really highlights the sort of experience that both of you bring.
Sun cities. Which is very exciting, I think, because for me, you know, thinking about the different researchers who are collaborating on this Sun Cities project now, it is so exciting for me that Ruth brings, you know, so much to bear from all these different worlds: art history, architectural history, music and architecture, sound and space. I mean, we can't necessarily investigate, let's say, these kind of more interstitial experimental practices and experimental realms without having a kind of, I think, open mind, you know, which is also partly opened because you're kind of going into these different worlds and you're open to, you know, what comes back and their, you know, points of connection. So for me, that's very exciting. And when we do then go to do workshops with architects, it's going to be a very different kind of thing than if it was someone with a very classical, let's say, training, and, you know, has only maybe encountered sound in a very kind of specific capacity. But we have also found that people who participate in our workshops, even if they have had, let's say, a more classical training, seem quite open. Because they also want to kind of experiment with different methods and try things, listen if they're an architect, do things with sound in a kind of creative capacity, think about those kind of musical methodologies, maybe sonic methodologies as well.
But I think from a spatial perspective, so, you know, doing the PhD at the Bartlett, certainly I think one of the key things that it did for me in my thinking in the way that I approach research is to really think of things as practice informed or practice related, as opposed to it sort of being very strictly history and theory versus a strict practice or, you know, a culture of practice. I think at the Bartlett School of Architecture, there is a fluidity across practice, critical spatial practice, you know, built practice, history and theory, and that for me definitely changed the way that I approach my research subject. And, you know, we should also mention that our other two team members, Christabel Sterling and Mathilde Morellis, also have this quite sort of eclectic research background. You know, Mathilde is a brilliant sound artist. Chrissy is incredibly talented ethnomusicologist, but she's also a DJ, and you know, and we all have these different sort of strings.
Yeah, absolutely. And Chrissy, I mean, you know, an ethnomusicologist who's really specialized in urban sonic ethnography and is kind of almost an urban sociologist as well. And so, you know, there is a richness, I think, at these kind of points. And Mathilde, she came in and she had already done 35 works on urban sound as a sound artist, and they're really impressive. I'll just plug one of her projects, and then I know we'll, maybe wrap in a moment, but actually two of her projects. One of the things that I just happened to come across, a work of Mathilde's, which I write about in Stereophonica. I was living in Belfast. She was living in Belfast at the time. I was working at the Sonic Arts Research Centre at the time. I went outside and I saw a kind of telecommunications box, and it had a poster on it with, it almost looked like a kind of spectral analysis of the frequencies of that hum coming out of that box. And I thought, what is this? And there was a QR code, and you could go to the website. And then it was this project she did called X Marks the Spot, which she was recording these telecommunications boxes all over Belfast, doing spectral analysis of them, then getting people to tag them, find other boxes, ask them to almost go on a kind of treasure hunt, and then, write about the boxes they had found, which actually had quite beautiful sounds once you listen to it. It was something, it's a part of almost the urban infrastructure that you don't notice. And there were these detritus sounds. And then artists created, sound installations with those sounds. And it had a whole kind of life of its own. And it was this also alternative, almost sound map of Belfast. She had a whole mapping side of it too. And so for me, that was such a beautiful project. It's introducing people to so many ideas, but in this very kind of friendly way, and, drawing them into this world. And ascribing value in a way to these kind of throwaway sounds that you just kind of normally ignore in the urban sphere.
But also just highlighting the inaudible or the usually inaudible elements of your city as a different way of orienting yourself within it.
Yeah,
I think
absolutely.
X Marks the Spot is quite sort of, interesting from that perspective as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And something that I think that's almost like a theme kind of running maybe through Mathilde's work. I don't know if you agree, Ruth.
I do.
She does a lot with kind of recording inaudible sounds. And she recently did a project called Sunnyside, which was during lockdown. At the time, she was living on Sunnyside Street in Belfast. She recorded the inaudible sounds in her home using kind of electromagnetic, I guess, recorders, as well as contact microphones, as well as hydrophones. I mean, some audible, some inaudible, but it was such a rich, incredible kind of soundscape. And her composition called Sunnyside. And but really, she wanted to draw attention to the home inside the city and all of the things that are coming in and out of it, the water, and that's part of a kind of infrastructural thing, or the electromagnetic kind of waves, I guess, with internet and things like that, and making all of that audible. And but also thinking critically about what's happening in lockdown and the kind of sustainability of this kind of living and the water use of. Anyway, there's a whole kind of critical dimension to that. But, as an artist, she's very interested in that kind of range of energies and how that is kind of coming to bear on the urban resident who,
It sounds like sort of the underlying themes around this are sort of encouraging and helping people think more critically about the sounds that they hear and even the ones that they can't hear.
That's exactly it. Thank you.
Can we quote you?
We're going to use that.
Yeah. But then also giving them a language to talk about that and to think about that. And I think that last one particularly has been a through line pretty much of everyone that we've spoken to, is one of the things that is a challenge about this perception of sound is the language that we use to talk about it. And so I really like, actually coming all the way back, I really like the idea of going to these sorts of experimental musical scores and taking the lessons that they all learned and the mistakes that they made there and what came out of that and applying that into developing this language for how people actually are able to communicate and think about the sounds that they hear and don't hear.
Great.
So I think, on that note, I think we'll end it there. And yes, you can quote me.
Thanks so much.
That was very useful.
Sometimes it's good to hear it coming back to you.
So just as the final plug, as you said, people can go to the website at soncities.org, and we'll have a link to that. Would you like to plug any Twitter handles or anything, personal websites, anything else that you'd like to plug?
You can follow us on Instagram and Twitter.
There we go.
Just at Sun Cities. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. And did you want to say anything about?
No, that's lovely. No, thank you so much.
No,
No. Okay.
So I think.
I don't know what you mean.
So thank you both very much. Thank you to Ruth.
Thank you very much for having
And
us.
thank you to Gascia.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you all for listening.
Hey, thank
Great.
you guys so much.
Cheers.
Hey.
Okay.
Well done.
Okay.
The rest is just noise.
You can find episodes of The Rest is Just Noise on all of your usual podcast apps.
And on our website at justnoisepod.com. We're also on Twitter as @justnoisepod.
The Rest is Just Noise is supported by the UK Acoustics Network.
Plus.